Hi, Cora Strack here again, Dr. Strack. Just another area of research I have completed is I've finished my work on the constitutional blind spot, the theory of the constitutional blind. We're integrating the time dimension into constitution, or introducing the time dimension in time-sensitive elections and related matters. So I think this is a new theoretical framework for constitutional law. So I'll be interested in seeing whether the courts will be prepared to accept it. I think it's important that it is brought into constitutional law, but obviously this is something that that's a matter for the Supreme Courts to adjudicate and decide on. But I think it's an extremely important development in constitutional democracy, and it's also very timely given the state of democratic decay that's been discussed, particularly in a recent excellent podcast by Anne Applebaum, a brilliant historian, over the years, who's been identifying this. And then I just happened to happen on this excellent podcast on my YouTube. It just kind of appeared at the top of my list. So I think that's the way the YouTube's algorithms work. So it worked in my favor because I was blown away by the similarity with regard to her work and my work. But my work was more obviously her work is very expansive in many areas. Mine is in a different area, but I think she was identifying very clearly that democracy was the erosion of democracy over time, and I'm trying to give a theoretical framework to that. And she identified elections as a key area where that erosion becomes very visible, and I'm trying to provide a theoretical framework for how that can be dealt with going forward, or can be repaired going forward. So this was a brilliant interview, and anybody that's interested in it, Sonia and Simon from Australia, two highly experienced are journalists and very independent and brilliant, absolutely amazing at the questions that they asked Anne Applebaum during that outstanding interview. And it was just a pure coincidence. Well, it was the algorithms that actually was been discussed in the interviews, that brought her that brilliant interview to my attention. So so I'm very excited about this constitutional blind spot. Very excited about these insights that I wouldn't have spotted it, only that I was in almost an impossible situation on the eve of the Irish presidential election. I was very embarrassed because the papers were saying that my genuinely good and sound constitutional, which I now believe was reframed, because I understand reframing is a tactic used to shut down election, constitutional challengers, and it's one of the most severe form of hiding the constitutional issue. It's kind of like gaslighting. Of course, I've studied that for years, so it came in very handy for understanding procedural reframing. So that's a huge, issue as well, and I'm finished that work as well. And I think it's very clear. I think if the Supreme Court examined that research, it'll be very clear. And this is a new dimension to the constitutional challenge that I didn't really realize that I'd be able to bring into it. In other words, how I got to this very embarrassing place on the eve of the presidential election, the sequence of events or doctrines or all those things that I talked about, the time delays and the importation of the doctrine of justicability, which hadn't been determined at Supreme Court level, into mine to worsen my personal grievance, and obviously I was regarded as a high risk. I think it was because perhaps the courts weren't happy about my protective disclosures challenges, but I can't see how what I'm saying is that the design is appalling. I mean, this has been said and spoken about in the Dáil a number of times by opposition people, so I can't see how they had such an issue with that. And I'm saying we need to look forward and we need to correct the current design, and hopefully have a better design going forward. So perhaps it was institutional caution or undue deference to the state. This can happen, in the lower courts, and they can often fear, these kind of challenges because if they haven't met them before, the only way that perhaps they can deal with them, if they're anyway half reasonable, is to refer them upwards. But the costs, hitting me with those costs for a genuine constitutional challenge was absolutely appalling. And it really points out to, what's done to people who challenge constitutional, who challenge elections. So it was a very good example, I think, of how what's done to the challenger in elections to undermine their rightful and indeed what they are supposed to do as democratic citizens is, if they find defects or believe that a nomination or election process is seriously defective, that genuinely a challenger should not be charged exorbitant costs. So this was a desperate thing to do to me, but I suppose it highlights what's done in democracies, and it really highlighted how democratic decay happens over time, particularly in time-sensitive elections and related matters. So I think the study I've done of how I got to where I got, and all the different tactics and strategies and doctrines that are applied to me, from when I entered the court, that studying of that sequence, the importation of a doctrine of justicability into mine, relying on something that hadn't actually been determined at the Supreme Court level, and all of these tactics, I think, are probably regularly used, in constitutional challenges globally to shut down and perhaps it's a model of how democratic erosion happens over time. So the introduction of the constitutional blind spot and asking the court to recognise it, is a major insight, which I didn't think I would ever, rise to the challenge of figuring out how I got there. But as somebody said to me, Corey, I wouldn't really like to take you on. You're not someone I'd like to, to take on. You're far too smart for anyone to underestimate you. But one never can be smart enough for manipulation. I mean, manipulation is very hard to outsmart. But nevertheless, this sequence was, I suppose in terms of mathematics, it wouldn't be Fermat's last theorem that would be needed to solve it. But still, it required a huge amount of work, and looking up all of this and trying to understand the procedural framing in particular was very hard to understand that one, and cluster analysis that I had done for a doctorate, postdoctorate for a while, that really highlighted how, what procedural framing is all about. And I needed a lot of, well, I won't say hints, but evidence to kind of figure out all of these tactics that are used. So it's a very interesting. It's very interesting just to see how I got to where I got, and then to examine it forensically and to produce the theory that I've done. And I'm delighted with it as a theoretical framework for hoping that democratic repair, basically. So I think it's better than anything else that's out there globally. I think at the moment, I think it's but it's so complex. Only very very few people, I suppose, will understand it. But I've written it in plain language, and I know that there are law scholars all around the world reading it. So I'm delighted at that. But of course, what we want is we just don't want it to be an academic exercise. We want it to be part of a policy, future policy, and a future framework for democratic repair. So having all the citations in the world on for an academic paper is of really questionable value if that paper has no influence on public policy or legal policy or constitutional law. So I'm more interested in this having an impact, and the impact, of course, would be to have it integrated in constitutional law, and that would be brilliant from the point of view of being a mathematician. That really would be a great honour to be the first person globally to spot or to have a theory, a coherent theory of how we can start to undo the damage caused by the lack of correction in constitutional law over time, particularly when it comes to the challenging of defective elections. And that's how power stays in a closed circle, because elections are rigged in various ways, and while we are interfered with, or intermissibly interfered with. Very, very nice language by the Irish Supreme Court. And yes, I think that the election in 2005 was intermissibly interfered with, but that is the decision for the Irish Supreme Court. But if they wanted my opinion, I am absolutely crystal clear that it was intermissibly interfered with. And I went around and I saw